Welcome to Beyond the Platform. I'm your host, Tony Montgomery, and with me today we have IFBB Pro John Jewett getting ready for the Olympia. How's everything going, man? You're like what, 5 to 6 weeks out?
I am 5 weeks out from the Olympia right now. So thanks for having me on here, Tony. Hopefully, my brain will still be functioning enough. I told yesterday. I swear I was sitting in front of my computer. I was ready for your call, and then I'm like, no, it's not the right day.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank God it wasn't, because that was legs. I was even more brain dead then. So
This is perfect. This is a rest day for you then?
it's a rest day, so it worked out.
Nice, man. Nice. Well, I appreciate you taking the time. I know, getting ready for the biggest show of the year through these kind of circumstances would maybe lend anyone to want to just be a recluse and like not have to talk or do anything. So I appreciate your time. You're someone that I followed for quite a bit, and I respect as far as like your creativity and your thought process when it comes to a lot of things. It seems like you have an open mind and a mind that's backed by a lot of the research, but also backed by some of the anecdotal stuff too. So I always find that to be a great conversation to have with someone who's open to both sides of the things. A true evidence-based practitioner, everyone throws those words around and it's like, yeah, you're just talking about evidence. What about the clinical side of things and the practitioner side of things, And then, so it's nice to have you on, man, so we can talk about some of this stuff.
Yeah, I definitely started off as a bro, as probably most of us all did. You just go in and train and trying to find what is there a better way to do this, and why do I do this? And the whys led to me just doing deep dive and doing nerd stuff. And maybe some people don't go that route, but
yeah, definitely not.
The culmination of the two, I think, can make you more efficient in progressing up into the ranks. And I think there's a lot of great pros out there that they're probably going to be great pros just by training hard and not having to think much about it.
Right.
I just knew that I felt like I wasn't. I obviously my genetics are good. I'm a pro, right? But I didn't see myself as being like Ronnie Coleman or something.
Right.
So it's like I need to make sure I can maximize every single variable possible. So let me nerd out and learn everything that I can to make sure I'm not leaving anything on the table.
Yeah, and I do seem to see that happening with a lot more of the pros. Like even, Mr. Olympia, Brandon Curry, he's reading Dr. Scott Stevenson's book. He's picking his brain. He's looking at the science and stuff. So I think it's starting to evolve into that a little bit more, because why wouldn't you, as a professional, like turn every stone over to find out, what is there that I can be doing to maximize my potential? Plus most pros, like, they just eat and train. So they have all this free time to do something. Might as well, instead of playing video games or starting a Twitch account, do some research and find better ways to maximize their potential. But I think you started off as a power lifter, right?
Yeah, I did. Been doing that. Did that since I was 16 till I was like 25. So I had a good streak of powerlifting.
So I think like starting off in that realm of things, and that can kind of allow you to have an open mind transition into a different sport, right? Because I started off in strongman, then I went to powerlifting, and that gave me like, okay, I got really strong doing this type of training for strongman. Now, how can I like maneuver some of that into powerlifting to, continue to progress and progress and progress? And then also, how can I be an expert in powerlifting as well? And I think having that open mind, being able to like shift from one thing to the other, where a lot of guys who just started, with the magazines and that's all they knew, they may not be as easily persuaded to try different things or have an open mind because, the magazines never told them anything different.
Yeah, I think culturally too now we're such an information driven culture, and the problem now is there's so much information.
Yeah.
But just even if you look back when I started bodybuilding, there wasn't that much out there. Like I didn't even have social media yet. That wasn't a thing. There was, but not Instagrams. And it seems like that's been a big driver for information. But since then, it's like, yeah, you're pretty much left to like magazines and what you're reading, or if you have a coach and what they're telling you. So there's really wasn't too many resources out to truly learn more. And now there's a lot. There's even more than we can even do with. So the problem now is who you're going to get your information from.
Right. Who's disseminating like good information, who's just trying to promote a business. And it's always difficult because you have the research side of things, and the research will always lend itself to the average person, and the average person may be able to get some type of muscle adaptation, hypertrophy stimulation through 5 reps in reserve. But then you see every pro bodybuilder trained into absolute failure. And it's like, how do you differentiate between the two when it comes to like, I want to do things by the book and research, but that research just doesn't make sense. And the research that like tells you, 30 to 40 sets of volume, you look at the actual like research paper and you're like, no one in their right mind could do that workout and survive on a day-to-day basis with any amount of strength whatsoever. So then how is that applicable to? So it's like disseminating the research and putting it into actual practice is the hardest thing for a lot of people, because there is so much coming out on hypertrophy now and bodybuilding and physique enhancement, which is great. But it's like, where do you tend to like draw that line of how do you decipher? So for you, like when it comes to the research, because you do look at the research, how much of that do you take with a grain of salt? How much of that do you take as like something you should look into a little bit more, or opening your eyes to things? What about the research is it that you look for in particular for your own style of training and your education and stuff like that?
Yeah, there's always a tough battle, I think, coming from my background as a powerlifter, because it was always very strength driven. And then going into bodybuilding, I just catered into the programs that were kind of strength driven as well.
Yeah.
So like, DC training, or even like Dorian Yates, that type of like mindset.
Right. Mike Menser type stuff.
Yeah. Similar thing. So it was always like that high effort. And even when I powerlifted, I was like the information that I was disseminated was like West Side Barbell.
Right.
So it was like max effort strength days, which there's no reps in reserve, at least how I was thought to apply it.
For sure. Yeah.
So it's basically we're maxing out once a week and then some speed days. But so that was always my background of like this high effort and what I catered into. And so now this hypertrophy, a lot more research is coming out on it. And I kind of, what I have to do is I can't just throw everything I've done out the window when you have got this result. It's like I've done something right. So how can I use this information and look through kind of like maybe it validates some of the things that I do, but then what can I take away of like maybe errors that I've made? Now I'm never going to like rewrite my whole plan because something groundbreaking has come out, because then you just lose all I know it's antidote because, yeah, well, John, maybe you could have just trained hard and you're going to be this pro either way. Like, and fair enough point. But I think seeing if there is a study and if it's as applicable as it could be, maybe in trained subjects, and then with consideration, like with, we have to think about these, most of these studies are in university settings and they're in a semester of school. So maybe it's an 8-week study, and the researchers, you have to keep in mind, like they want to see some type of hypertrophy occur. So they're going to throw these guys through the ringer to see a good response. So this might be like an 8-week study of something that's not sustainable, like you said.
Yeah.
So I just have to go through these studies and look through and see how applicable is this into what I already am doing in training wise, and if there is something that I can take over to what I'm currently doing. But I'm not going to throw everything out the window because of a recent one study that came out. I think we should just be looking at everything as a whole, and I don't think we have everything as a whole yet to truly say like what is the best way to train. And I think it's still obviously the basic programming thing should be adherence and sustainability. So I have a psychology that definitely favors towards like a higher effort, lower RIR style of training. But there's lots of similarities among like the other approaches where you keep at a lower RIR, maybe you have different progression schemes. But I think big picture, if you took these things apart and explained it to someone that didn't know much, they're like, these kind of look the same. Right. And then it gets more nuanced and you're like, okay, there's some differences here. But I've definitely have opened my mind to a lot of things, especially with what Mike Isertel has been putting out with Renaissance periodization and his progression models, and that's really challenged my thought process because I think back of things that I've done. I had years of like where I pretty much never changed my volume, and I'm just train hard and at a high effort and progress my load and reps. And I had growth happen. Now, I could look back at that and say, well, there's probably times when I just kept doing that, I got injured, right? So I'm like, okay, maybe that would have been a time when it's like you can't just keep doing the same thing forever, and there should be some times of like maybe rotating out volume, maybe times where you do pull back a little bit on your effort, and maybe times when you can push harder up into it. So these are the kind of things that I've been building now into my programs, and I think he's brought forth a model for that has worked well in his application. I do things a little differently, but I definitely have gotten away from my just never change volume and just train as hard as you possibly can, bro. Right. But sure. Yeah. So your question, like disseminating the information. Yeah. So I look at guys that have similar thought processes at level that I'm at, that can logically explain why they're doing something. I think if you can logically explain everything that you're doing, that might be someone that has some good antidote to provide. And then looking at research, of course, and what they're putting out, and looking at, I think the first spot would be look at like a meta-analysis or a systematic review of this information, rather than trying to pick apart individual studies. For someone that's kind of new and getting into it, I think looking at maybe some review papers or something would be a great start to get kind of a big picture approach.
Yeah, no, definitely. And one of the things you mentioned was like you try to find someone with similarities, and as an educator and as someone who's trying to always learn, it's like, well, how do I find also people that don't just confirm my biases as well? Like, who do I find that's going to challenge my thoughts that I respect enough that I'll be open-minded and listen to? And that's something that's very difficult. But, just speaking on what you said with like Mike is someone who is a hard trainer. He actually looks like a scientist who's trained, which is something that you always try to look for, right? And then you got guys like Dr. Darren Willoughby, who's like almost 60 years old and he's 260 pounds. And it's like, man, that's someone that I would like to talk to about training, because he's been in academia for 30 years and he's also, put in the work. And I've interviewed him for the podcast, and it's like, well, what would you recommend as far as like your training split? He's like, I do a bro split. It's like, oh, but the research tells you that you shouldn't do that. And it's like, yeah, but that's just what I do because that's what I found to work best for me. And that's the nuance, right? It's like, you got to find a good start point, which is, like you said, a meta-analysis. And then from there, you got to slowly figure out what works best for you, and how do you define that, right? And being able to find people that challenge your biases is something that's always going to be a good thing to just allow you to be more creative in your thought process. Because the more rigid you get, the less creative you are. Then it's sometimes you don't find things like a new fit or like a blood flow restriction or something like that can make you be like, oh, that's just gimmicky. But, to have that creativity, you're like, well, let me try it for like 6 weeks and see what happens. And I guess the great thing about the research too is like, well, we know we can elicit some type of adaptation in like maybe 6 to 8 weeks. So if I try this stuff out and I train hard, close to failure, like I should get something out of it. It is a new stimulus, right? So I think that's something that's always thought of, is like, how can you find someone that's going to challenge your biases? And do you ever go out of the way to look for those type of people? Or is that just so far adrift from what you actually believe helps with hypertrophy and growth that it's not even worth looking into?
Well, I think the people that I have found, they're not as different as you would think. Like if we get if you get nuanced about it, it does. Like I'm a big fan of Jordan Peters, out of the UK. He's educated and logical. I think he has his master's in exercise science, but he's definitely like a bro first, right? And he weighs like his coaching experience, his antidote before a lot of the stuff that might be in the research. And so he's someone that actually would be probably easily confirm my biases. But when I really watch how he trains, there's a lot of just auto intuition that he does in his training that just is not verbalized and to put titles on it like you might in research. So and I don't want to misquote him, but let's take just an example. Someone that would say that I always train to failure. Their first week into their first mesocycle, they're like, yeah, I hold back mentally a little bit on my first set.
Yeah.
And so it's like, okay, so it's still a hard set, but if we were to put a number to this and gauge it, maybe it's an RIR of 1 or something. So it's like, in turn, you're still maybe using RIR. It's just you just have an intuition of using it, and you haven't been able to, like, assign it to these different sets that you do. Then maybe by your last 4 week or week 5 of your meso, you're going all out. So there's individuals that have that antidote, but they're just not quite speaking in the way that we see a lot of these ones that are really, really versed in the literature that are. But if you really look at their programs and what they're saying, there's a lot of similarity there.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a good point, because I still like, I tend to listen to more of the guys that kind of confirm my biases. And we all do it. It's like easier for me to do, but that's why I guess I do like listening to Mike so much, because he's challenged so many of the biases that I do have, and the thought process of just how I like to train.
Yeah.
And it has open mind. So I wouldn't go, if someone's just way out in left field, I wouldn't listen to that person, but they're probably not being that logical anyway.
Yeah. Cause I always think of like a Charles Poliquin, right? Like when he came out with all his stuff, everyone was like, you're crazy. Like, this makes no sense. There's no science to back it up. And then, 10 years down the road, it's like, oh, okay, the guy might be onto something. Maybe his neurotyping might not be what everyone thinks it is, but maybe it will be down the road. And, it's like that guy was a trendsetter, and he was able to create a lot of thoughtful processes and he always had a reason for it. I guess that's kind of the biggest thing, right? Like, if you can explain why you're doing something and it makes logical sense, then why not do it, right? But you'll have some people who, like Paul Chek, someone who talks about, you shouldn't do any type of bilateral squatting. But he deals with hockey players, so it's like, well, maybe they should only do single leg stuff. But people will take that snippet and be like, oh, he hates back squats. It's like, well, there's nuance to everything. And I think that's a great point that you made, is like, finding those people that challenge you enough, but aren't so far out of left field to where you're like, oh, I got to rewrite my entire program. Cause like you said, it's worked for so long. And, one of the biggest things that I've always thought about when it comes to like programming for hypertrophy, and I talked to Dr. Scott about it last week, was like, the periodization model doesn't really need to exist for hypertrophy training, but it should be more thinking about it in terms of like stress adaptation, the fatigue stimulus ratio, like, and then being able to auto regulate on a day-to-day and week-to-week basis is going to be more important in building out a successful program. Not like, this is my hypertrophy block, then I'm going to transition to like a strength hypertrophy block, and then, blah, blah, blah down the road. So when it comes to like your initial thought process of designing a program, and I know this is a very open-ended question, but let's just use you for an example, because obviously you'll have the best information on you, and it may not be applicable to everyone, but at least you'll have some commonality behind it, and you'll have some reason behind everything you do.
Yeah.
Where if I was like, oh, 5'10", 200-pound man, you're like, you got to ask like 100 questions. We wouldn't be done with the podcast. So for you, when you're designing a base program to start, does it look different? I guess that would be the first question. Does it look different throughout the year? Like, off-season program looks like this, and then in-season program looks like this, because the perception is, right, like, that should change a lot. Well, some people think the perception is like that should change from one to the other. So what is your thought process on that type of program design?
Yeah, so I don't, if you looked across the year, I would say there's probably not as much change as what maybe some people, how they would program it. I typically have kind of a base structure of a split then that I go with. Usually it's push-pull legs. That's what I've been with, and I use a lot of derivatives of that depending on what my goal might be within that off season or that period. And how frequently I train, like doing push-pull legs, will just purely come down to my recovery capacity in that time frame. So a lot of times I'm starting with like a push-pull off, legs off. Like, that's kind of my base approach that I'll have for a split design for myself. And then bringing in emphasis. So like for me, like a lot of the weak body parts are usually shoulders and chest and back. So rather than try to bring up all that at one point, I'll run a block where I'll back down legs to just once a week, and I'll have like 2 pull sessions that are, or even 2 to 3 that I rotate in, and then push is brought down some, the frequency. And so I might have like a 12-week span of doing that, and then rotate it to where I have like push days that are 2 to 3 days a week, pull days brought back down to like once, and legs are still at once. Usually legs is such a strong point for me.
Yeah.
So I can keep that lower, but at this level, and whoever's listening, they need to take consideration that I'm a 212 bodybuilder, and I'm very close to that 212 cap.
Right.
So I'm not someone who's going to, and at my level, going to be adding like 10 pounds of stage weight on to the year. It has to be very like direct of where I'm trying to add this tissue on. So I'll rotate in these type of like specialization blocks to like put all resources towards one muscle group and give enough stimulus in that muscle group. So if I'm trying to do everything at once, usually there's a lot of fatigue. And so then that next block I can rotate in and put emphasis into that other muscle group. And but overall, if you looked at it, the structure is fairly similar. I mean, it's still like a push-pull legs routine. It's just, volume is what I can recover from, and week to week is I auto-regulate it. So I have a base structure that I do, and have some set volumes, because I already kind of know ideally like where my volume tolerances are, and just kind of start with that. And I'm not one that's going to be progressing volume up throughout the whole block. I usually let something ride for 3 to 4 weeks so I can get a good grasp of where we're at. Usually when I first start a routine, loads are progressing, reps are progressing, I'm getting used to like exercise order. And that's usually at the first beginning. So there's no reason for me to add in extra volume, extra stimulus when I'm already getting some good adaptations initially. Then once I'm like my 4th week in, I can kind of assess like, is everything progressing how I think it should? Is something not moving? Is something recovering really, really well? Okay, maybe I'll add like 1 set on and let that ride out the rest of the time. But I am in more favor of kind of keeping volume more constant throughout the block. And at the end of the block, I can look back throughout, see how everything was progressed, and then kind of decide into the next block if maybe I should be moving up in volume or not. But just for myself, my volume window is pretty tight. I think as you get it's moving from that, and using Mike's term, like your MEV window is short, and to get into MRV it could just be the difference of adding 1 set or not. So there's not a lot of progression. So I start like at a much higher volume level, and at the end of like a mesocycle, there's really not much change really that's going to be going on.
That makes sense, because as you become more advanced, right, your ability to execute from rep 1 to rep 10 is nearly perfect, right? But as a beginner, your execution, you may have to accumulate more volume throughout that session because you're not able to fully recruit those muscles, or you're not really able to get that connection that you want to. So maybe you are only doing 2 sets because from rep 1 to rep 10, you feel everything working that needs to be worked. But a beginner may do 4 sets to get that same amount of work that you just did in 2 sets, just because they're having a harder time connecting. And maybe that's where that volume progression comes from, where a lot of people think like as a beginner, maybe you can handle more volume because you're not as strong. Your recovery capabilities are a little bit higher. So maybe that push pull legs looks like push pull legs rest repeat instead of push pull rest legs rest. Do you think that that's something that beginners should factor in? Like how much volume do you think they should be handling? Because in my mind, it's like, well, you should do volume to where you can start feeling the muscle work, and that's just going to take practice. So yeah, you might be doing more volume than you need to be doing initially, but that might be the practice that you need to have to get that connection. Now it's kind of like powerlifting, right? Like when you start powerlifting, you may need to squat 3 to 4 times a week, but as you become a 700-pound squatter, you're probably going to squat like once every 14 days.
Yeah, I think once you get into like the early beginner and intermediates, that's where that conversation changes about how I train, and I keep my effort level pretty high, because I think, and this is just my thought, and you can interject here, but I think these, like, if we're going to call them stimulating reps, those reps as you're approaching failure, I think as you get more advanced, you probably do need to get closer to that failure point. Like an RIR of 3 for someone that's intermediate might be a good stimulus, but maybe for someone advanced, that RIR 3 is just no longer stimulating. You have to get to that 2, 1, or even 0. So that's why that it has to get up there so high. But for like a beginner or intermediate, I think you have a great point of that should be an emphasis on learning the movements and putting execution first. And how do you get better at doing a movement? Well, you have to do it a lot, right?
Yeah.
And so having higher volumes would just make sense for a beginner. The loads are going to be lighter. To reach a point of like true muscular failure, they're probably not going to be able to coordinate that movement correctly anyway. So right. I mean, to see programs like to say like, oh yeah, you're supposed to train to failure and hard effort, and that's the way to go. And then would you go tell a beginner that's never walking, yeah, man, go squat. I want you to squat till you can't do any more reps. And you got to crawl out from the squat rack. Like, no one in their right mind would tell a beginner to go and train like that. The focus would just be on make sure you do every rep perfect. When you can't do a perfect rep, then just rack it. And for some people, that might be like an RIR of 4 or 5. Yeah. The issue with that though is how do you program it, right? So if you told a new person do an RIR of 4, well, God, who knows? That might be like an RIR of 10, right?
Right. Because the research would kind of show like, you bring people in and you tell them to do, max, what's your 10 rep max? And they say, oh, it's this. And they do it and they end up getting 25 reps. It's like, do they really know where true failure is, right? So maybe as a beginner, as long as it's not an exercise that requires a lot of stability as a squat, but say it's like a leg press, maybe you tell beginners to go to failure because they have to find that threshold eventually somewhere. And maybe their failure is actually 5 reps in reserve, right? But if you give them a 5 reps in reserve, they're going to be so overwhelmed with like thinking about where should I stop that it may not be the best. I can justify telling a beginner to go to failure on exercises that don't require stability or lower back loading because they're not really going to know what failure is. Right. Yeah. So, maybe in a year or two, they'll finally get to that point where it's like, oh, this is what failure training really is. And by that time it's like, yeah, now we can start thinking about doing things with reps in reserve and such, in that nature, because the literature will tell you like people don't know where true failure is, especially a beginner to an intermediate.
Yeah. I think that's a great way to program it too for beginners. Like, and like a example is like a bicep curl. Like what is the learning curve for a bicep curl? It's really low. I mean, we bicep curl all day long, right? Right. I would feel comfortable in saying, hey, take your bicep curl to failure, do as many as you can. And so it can teach someone that high effort level. So maybe even though they're learning these other complex moves of like a barbell row or whatever it may be, you can take some isolation movements to really high effort levels, do it safely and still get some good stimulus and teach them that effort level. So, and then just over time, just progressing loads and increasing reps. If you have that, you should have that built in as a beginner. At some point, they're not going to be able to add load and reps, and they're going to reach a point of like, oh shit, I'm pretty much about to fail or I'm failing, right? And so then you're probably an intermediate by that point,
right? Yeah, because I mean, if you say you do tell a beginner go to reps in reserve of 4, and it's really like 10. Well, if you progress every week, it'll eventually get to that point of 0, right? So at least that first week, you want to give them a base to start at, and then just progressively increase load until it gets to, no reps in reserve. And that may be a year, that may be 2 years for some people, depends on where they start. So in order of like determining for yourself rate of progression, right? You said that you continue to add load and progressive overload is the way you do that. But as an advanced lifter, maybe you do. I couldn't imagine you doing the same exact workout week to week. So do you create rotations for certain days? So if you have a push, do you have a push 1, a push 2, a push 3, so that it's kind of like conjugate for hypertrophy, right? Where like you have that variation so that you can push it closer to failure, knowing that next week the exercises are going to be different, but do you have something like that? Or do you do the same exercises? So I know like someone like Dr. Mike, who is really nuanced on like, this progression. We're going to start with these exercises and at like 3 reps in reserve, and we're going to stay with these exercises all the way through this entire block. But because you are starting off not close to failure, you may be able to progress those things. But if you're training to failure, do you need that rotation and that variation to allow you to create that adaptation and stimulus? Or how do you do that for your own programming?
Yeah, so like if I did the same exercises and just rotated my push day, push day A, push day A, the rate of progression, I could go into a session, you might not have any change in motor reps because you're at an advanced level, so the rate of change is just going to be really, really slow. So I will have an A and a B rotation, and I've done like coming from DC training, it would be like an ABC rotation, and eventually you come back, but I eventually find like my C rotation would start be picking movements that were like just suboptimal,
different to be different.
Like
yeah.
Right. Then I'm like, well, why am I doing this? Like I have this one prime D handle pull down that I like feel my lats. It's awesome. I love it. And then I go to like a straight bar pull down. I'm like, oh, this is shit, but it's my rotation. I'm supposed to be doing this. Like, why does that make any sense? Like if I have a great movement,
point. Yeah.
Damn, I should just do that great movement, but for the most part, I do have an A and B rotation with some caveats to that if I have a movement that I just absolutely connect with, awesome, I'll just keep that movement in place.
Yeah, I like that.
Progress slower in it. Hey, I progress slower in it. But yeah, usually the A, B rotation. And then I have rep range rotations within that too.
I was going to ask you that. Like if you have exercise A that you love, and it's like the D handle lat pull down. So is that week 1 maybe is like that 8 to 12 rep progression, and then week 2 maybe that 12 to 15 rep progression, so that way you're at least progressing those 2 tiers at the same time.
Right. Okay. Right. So it makes it entertaining for me too, rather than like every time I come in, I'm going to do this set of 10 of my D handle pull downs. So I do like working up to like a top set of 6 to 10 reps, and then doing a back off set of 10 to 15 reps. And so if I have that A rotation, maybe the one time I'm hitting my set of 6, then my back off will be the set of 10. When I come back to that same workout, I'll do my top set to a set of 10, and my back off set will be a set of 15.
Yeah.
So it's almost, you're getting like 4 rotations in before you repeat that same movement with the same rep progression. And so it gives you the adaptation where we can actually see some movement occur on the bar. But that's not to say that I'll micro load and add poundage where I can. I just bought some like 1 pound and a quarter little micro plates to add on. 'Cause it's
nice.
Like, if you're doing a set of 8 with whatever, 200 pounds, like it's going to be a while maybe before I could do my 9 reps, right? It might be a while before I can add a 25 pound on the bar, but hell, if I can put on this little
something, right? Yeah.
I feel like it's like I'm laying a piece of rope on the bar,
A little extra chalk on it or something, like there's some more dirt on it. Yeah, for sure. That makes sense.
You have maybe a 1% increase in load, but if you keep doing that over time, it can add up.
It's important, for sure. Yeah.
So that's how I would normally program it. And with my background, I've been definitely in the issue of like chasing the logbook numbers, and by the end of a meso, my whatever that lift looks like, starting to look like a different lift. I'm speeding up the pace, and so
your joints start to hurt more than you're filling your muscles, for sure.
Yeah,
I think we've all been there.
An understanding that to make an adaptation occur, you have to force more to happen. And it's like, well, it should be the adaptation occurred and now I have the capability to do more.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how I've been thinking about my load progressions, is that the logbook is more of a gauge of that I have an adequate training program that is causing adaptation. I can now increase load. So it kind of takes some relief off of training, knowing that, hey, if I have the capability to do more, I'm going to do more, and I'm force it, but I'm not going to be trying to, wiggle my way or, myself to getting extra reps. And when I first came from powerlifting into like DC training and a logbook progression, like, oh, hell yeah. Like I'm just going to move weight. That's all. Like point A to point B, get stronger. I can do that. And I'm going to get bigger in turn. And that kind of works to a sense, but it was the right kind of the right approach, but with the wrong mindset or logic behind it. And that's not what Dante actually does, preach and what he says. So just my bro powerlifter interpretation of it.
Yeah, for sure, man. That's something that I have to fight with constantly with powerlifters on their accessory work, is like, we're not just trying to move the weight, we want some type of stimulation to occur. And I like that with the logbook, what you said, because I do the same thing. It's just it's allowing me to understand my ability to recover from session to session. So if my rest is good, my nutrition is good, then my logbook should reflect my ability to recover, and I should be able to make that progress. But, if I only got 6 hours of sleep, that's going to reflect in my inability to progress. And that logbook is kind of telling me that. It's kind of like your Whoop band without having to spend $20 a month on it, right? To track your variabilities that will dictate your ability to recover. So I definitely love that you said that. And then also too, right? Like if you can't mimic the execution lift to lift, then the adaptation is going to be different. So if you're doing a 6-repper and one week it looks like this form, and then the next week it looks like the other form, those are two completely different lifts, even though they're the same lift. So you're working different, the execution has to be on point for you to actually progress and adapt to that stimulus. So in your mind, as an advanced lifter, you have a couple ways to advance stimulus. You have exercise rotations, and then you also have rep range rotations. Is that fair enough to say? In like a quick synopsis? Yeah. So then as a beginner, right, they don't need all that type of variation. Would you say that as a beginner, maybe following that, like find exercises that you connect with and just continue to run them into the ground as much as you can within that same kind of rep range? Would that be your advice to someone who's beginning when it comes to like creating that adaptation?
Yeah, I think early out, this thing that we were talking about of learning execution and your movement patterns, sticking with the same movements, because they're just going to keep progressing. You're going to keep adding load and reps. And the rationale for me rotate exercises, because I'm just not able to do that as frequently. So it takes some more time to see those changes. And for a beginner, like, gosh, if you're always rotating out your exercises, it's going to take a lot slower time to have those neural patterns learned. So it makes sense to have the same exercises and progress up. But I do think maybe after a few of those type of training blocks, I mean, that doesn't have to be frequently, maybe every 12 weeks, there maybe is some type of rotation in there, maybe just to prevent chronic just movement pattern
burnout.
And just keep it. Yeah. Sure. Keep it interesting too. And is there anything wrong with having a rotation pattern as a beginner? No, I think that would be perfectly fine. Like, are you going to not be able to learn your squat because you rotate in maybe a different squat variation? No, right. I wouldn't think so.
Your knees still bend, your hips still flex the same way. So it's the same thing, just a different bar.
I think that's because when you look at some of the beginner programs, like, man, they look really boring. And for a beginner that's just trying to get into it,
right?
It's like, no, man, you don't need to rotate your lifts. You just do this and you do the same reps and you're just going to grow. It's like, oh, that's freaking awesome. But at the same time, you're a beginner and you have to think about the psychology of a beginner and keeping it entertaining, right?
Yeah.
I think when you're motivated and you have fun in your training program, that's when you're going to be seeing the best progress, in my opinion. As long as you're not doing something totally out there and crazy, but so I don't think there's anything wrong with rotations. I think maybe you should actually potentially have some in there, or at least every few blocks be changing exercises just to keep them enjoyable for the new guy.
And then as you're progressing, right, within your logbook, just write down, hey, this exercise felt really good. So that's going to be something that I'm going to always remember to keep in. And then this exercise, I just felt it in my lower back when I'm supposed to be feeling it in my traps and rear delts and stuff like that. So maybe this exercise is shit for me, right? Because as a beginner, you're not really going to understand your biomechanical deficiencies and your morphologies that are going to be like, well, this exercise is shit for me. It's like I have the smallest shoulder delt like caps in the world, so maybe I shouldn't be doing overhead presses, but I wouldn't know that as a beginner, right? So you have to start to understand like this, I feel really good with this exercise. This exercise feels safe is another one that's important too, right? Like if you're always scared for your safety under an exercise as a beginner, like that's not good either. And it's like, well, do I feel it in this muscle or do I feel it in my joints? If I feel it in the muscle, then this is a good exercise. If I feel it in the joints, there's something going on that I need to fix. So those are the things that I would be writing down in my logbook as I'm progressing. It's not just numbers, but it's like a diary where you can just start writing stuff down: sleep, hydration, food, like all that. And that way you can look back on it and be like, okay, this is what made me progress the most. And I think that's where a lot of the logbook stuff gets neglected. Everyone just thinks it's reps and sets. It's like you should have so many different intricate details in there, or at least somewhere, right? Whether it's, people don't do like logbooks. People make fun of me when I have my paper and pen at the gym all the time. I'm like, yeah, you're on your phone for 30 minutes in between sets, and at least I don't have to worry about that, you know?
I've progressed my logbook onto Excel on my phone.
Oh, nice.
Of course, it is pain in the ass when Excel deletes my workout or something, but oh well, it's been, my logbooks like fall apart. I'm like, oh shit, pages going everywhere. Yeah. I did go digital, but no, that's an excellent point. And I think as you get advanced, you just get so intuitive that it just kind of happens, and don't end up logging this down. But to actually tell a beginner like, hey, these are things like how to pick a good exercise. And it's like, well, so-and-so said I need to stabilize my elbow. I need to be pointing my pinky up like this and hitting it just like that. And it's like, well, do you feel it when you do it in your bicep? Like, well, no, I'm feeling my shoulder or something. It's like, well, then that's probably shit for you, even though it like looks correct as far as what the expert told you how to do it. So I think a great for a beginner is like, do you feel it where you're supposed to?
Yeah.
At the same time, a beginner might not have that. Like if you do a squat, do you feel in your quads? It's like, I don't know, maybe they won't have that awareness. But I think those are just good things, like you said, to start noting down for someone. Like if you're feeling in your target muscle, or, hey, it hurts when I bring my military press all the way down to my chest. It's like, well, don't take it down that far.
Yeah,
just
right, exactly.
train within where you're safe to train. And so it just gets me on a thought that I keep seeing lately has been the complicated exercise selection of movement patterns based on like the shortening and resistance and strength profiles, and this loads the lengthening and this loads the stretch.
It's very popular right now because people are trying to differentiate themselves as businesses, right? So how do you do that? You talk about the complicated stuff so people think you know what you're talking about.
Yeah, and that's such a nuanced, high level item. And I just think if you're like a beginner or even intermediate, like it's very cool and stuff to talk about, interesting. But I don't think you quite need to go there. It's pick some great basic movements that we all know, train the muscles that they should be, and go with those. But I think there's a lot of sales techniques going on with these profiles and loading different phases.
No, I couldn't agree more with you on that. Like I went to Ben Bukolski's seminar a year or two ago, and great seminar. It's very high level, but there's some people in there that are just so worried about execution that they're doing cables with like 5 pounds on it. I'm like, you're not going to grow anything with 5 pounds. Like that's, that doesn't mean anything at all right now. But that person thinks like execution is the most important thing. And it's like, just like you got to find that fine balance of moving weight while trying to get better at execution. As long as you're not going to get injured, then you can start to refine that later on down the road. But don't let perfection be in the way of like good enough to make progress. Yeah.
There's a balance to strike with like execution and where do you allow like a little bit of sway. Like I've seen like barbell rows where people are like, rowing like, 50 pounds and they're just like glued, in places. Like you can allow a little bit of swing to happen and just move some load, you just need some stimulus to happen.
Right.
You see guys that just swing weight around. They're like still like
pretty
big guys.
Big.
Right? Yeah. So you're going to get some stimulus, but if you don't move enough or you just might not be getting enough.
Yeah. Exactly. So then when it comes to, we have kind of the outline and we have ways to create adaptation and progress. So then when it comes to like exercise selection, are you more of the believer that like the heavier compound stuff should be first, or are you a pre-fatigue guy, or are you someone that trains your weaknesses first, regardless of if that's a heavy compound movement? Like how do you set up your rationale for like, this is what I'm going to do today, and this is why, this is the logic behind it?
Yes, I have a slight mix of both. So I am trying to set up most of my workout to have optimal performance throughout the session and across movements. So I won't be one where I have a lot of isolation work that is going to be pre-fatiguing into movements that might already train that muscle group very efficiently. So, but there might be situations where that could be ideal depending on the movement. And now also if I could train a weakness first and not have it impede into my main compound movements, then I will. But I'll definitely structure that order into favoring weaknesses as well.
Could you give an example of both of those?
Let me give an example. You know, that was like real convoluted, right? Like, okay, what do you mean, John? So like a push day. So for me, the focus is always on delts. Chest is like a secondary focus or a weakness, and then triceps are a stronger point. So that's my mindset going into programming. So I always start with a lateral raise first, an isolation movement. I don't find doing an isolation movement on like a side delt has any type of fatiguing effect going into my pressing movements for the day. Also, side delts, you can never have your side delts big enough. You know, it's like for bodybuilding purposes, like the wider the better, basically. And so that's a movement that I'll start with. And then from there, I'll progress in picking my compounds of what do I want the focus on for that session. Are your shoulders weak? Then it's starting with an overhead press. Then is it chest next? Then it'll be a flat press compound movement. Then doing, and I rotate between these. I might go into a chest isolation afterwards, before going into my tricep press, because I don't feel like chest really is a limiting factor going into like a close grip bench press. It's still triceps for me. Yeah. And so then it'd be like a tricep compound, and then I'd have isolation work for triceps after. Now, that's not to say that I haven't programmed things differently. And I've done sessions where guys have super weak arms and do like a tricep push down first into a close grip bench press afterwards. And because, within the bench press, I think it loads the pecs really, really well. And the triceps, I mean, all they fail, you kind of top mid range. I don't think that's quite the limiting factor. So if I can get more stimulus and pre-fatigue, essentially pre-fatigue, and before going into the bench press, then I would. Yeah. But like where that wouldn't make sense to me would be doing like a leg extension going into a squat when the squat loads the quads in the lengthen phase very, very well. Like it's already a good builder for the quad, while like going into the bench press is not going to be the best builder for the triceps. So you could pre-fatigue, maybe get more of effect. So I think what your movement pattern is going for a compound movement would depend on what you're doing in isolation first. But generally that's how I structure out my sessions of focusing on weaknesses and then putting the priority of compound movements of what I'm trying to bring up first, and then working down into isolation movements. And those compound movements would have those top sets and those back off sets like we talked about earlier. Then the isolation movements, I'll just move them up to like the 12 to like 20 rep range. So I stay higher rep on them. And it varies. And honestly, it just depends how I feel for the day. So it's something that's not as programmed as Strictly, which is like, oh no, we need everything to be programmed strictly. It's like with those, I just, something that I just like to have fun with, honestly. Yeah. So I start with a 20 rep and then do a 15, then a 12, or I might hit a 12, then back off and do an 18 and 20. So as long as I'm just doing however many hard sets I need for that isolation movement is what I do for the day.
Yeah, I also feel like too, when people chase those isolation movements too much with progression, that they start to lose that connection with them. So if you can just train, like you said, kind of intuitively to where you always feel those muscles working, and like I need at least 3 hard sets, and it can be anywhere from that 12 to 30 rep range that elicits hypertrophy, then that's fine. But if you're like, I did 12 last week and now I have to add 5 pounds and do 12 again, then those reps start to look a little bit shittier, and you start to lose that ability to fully isolate those muscles, because whether you're the best trainer in the world, like you're going to compensate somehow to complete the rep. So the idea of like just trying to find ways to stimulate the muscle by just, doing it intuitively makes a lot of sense with those things. Like bicep, I couldn't imagine trying to improve my bicep curl week to week progressively. Like I would just rather try to get a pump in them,
Exactly. And I know that sounds bro right, but it's exactly how I train, like the
Yeah.
isolation. So I'm basically trying to get the best pump, stimulus, squeeze, all that stuff like on those movements. And the progression will come over time, but that's not the focus of like me, like, trying to increase loads like I do with my compound
Yeah. I
movements.
mean, right. We know like the two main drivers of hypertrophy is like mechanical tension and metabolite buildup. Getting a pump is the same thing as metabolite buildup, but a pump is a
Yeah.
bro way of saying it. And as soon as you say a
Yeah.
pump, they're like, oh, they dismiss you. But if you say, oh, I'm doing metabolic work, they're like, oh, you must know what you're talking about. It's like, it's the same fucking thing. What do you mean?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know?
There's a lot of crossover too, because it's now like a separate thing, right? So it's like, no, this is my metabolite training, this is my loading training, but you're still loading when you're doing metabolite training, or if you're
Right.
doing loading, you're still going to have metabolites occurring. But I guess it's more of a,
What's a spectrum for sure?
easier
Everything's a spectrum.
conceptual learning for
Yeah.
people.
Oh, yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely. So in terms of that, right? Would you ever do any type of intensifiers at the beginning, or do you feel like adding those type of things in, like a drop set or like a superset or a rest pause set? Do you feel like that would create so much fatigue that the rest of your session would kind of fall to waste? And if that's the case, well, where do you put those in, right? And do you only put them in when you're in a surplus, or you find benefit when you're in a deficit? Because I know a lot of people take them out when they're in a deficit because it's harder to recover from. So when do you like to add those type of things into your program to kind of elicit some type of novel stimulus to maybe push you past the plateau?
Yeah, so I mean, this push day, for example, like I have it set up. I have some set volumes. I'm going to be hitting straight sets off these exercises just to start with. On my compound movements, I've always stuck with straight sets throughout.
Yeah.
And I haven't gone into, because coming from DC training, we would do rest pause sets on these compound movements, but um, and then this is the part where I've like looked into the more of the literature and kind of had to evaluate these things, and
Mm-hmm.
it does seem that like very short rest times just give you less productive sets, and you might need to do more of those sets because of it. So if I have a good rest period and can produce like good high effort, I really do that on my compound lifts and stick with straight sets. But I do think it's like a huge drop of fatigue for doing it on a compound movement, a rest pause set, or even a drop set for that matter. If I was to add something like that in, it would be into my isolation movements.
Yeah.
And I think for someone that's advanced, that's a great way. If you are going to do a volume progression scheme, it's an easy way to add in a set and not have like drop like a big hammer into your program, right? Like adding one set on your squat versus one set on your leg extension is a very different thing. So it might be a way to kind of like micro increase volume
Yeah.
versus like like this huge volume increase. So you could think of a progression like that of maybe, hey, I'm trying to bring up quads. I'm going to add like a rest pause set on my leg extension. Then maybe in another 2 weeks, I'm going to have like another rest pause that goes onto that. Or could it be even a drop set for that matter?
Right.
But it would have to be still under the stipulation that you have these loads are still progressing in your sessions.
If that's some way to track it, right? Yeah.
Right. So you have like your recovery tools are in place, and you are able to recover from these sessions. And then if you're all good for that, then yeah, go for those.
Yeah.
But that's usually where I would put in those type of movements.
Yeah.
But if I was going to add a set to a compound, I would still do it as a straight set. And I've done that before too.
Yeah.
I've gotten to where, and this has been on back day, because you get stuck in these thought processes, right, of how you like to do things. That I do a top set and a back off set for compound.
Oh yeah,
that's what I do. Well, why can't you do a third set? Oh, there's people out there
I don't even know what rep range to do on a third set. That's bananas.
What do you do?
Yeah.
So then I think like I have back days where I'm like, all right, I'm going to do a vertical pull, a horizontal, a vertical, then a horizontal. And then I'm like looking at my program, I'm like, oh shit, why don't I just do like 3 sets on this vertical, maybe 3 sets of horizontal. I just pick one other movement. That's why I did 3 exercises instead of 4.
Yeah.
And it's like, and then I'll have some movements where I'm like, I do 2 sets. I'm like, man, that felt great. I still feel like I got some more though, and it doesn't feel completely taxed out from it. So that's when I'm like, you know what? I'm going to do a third set here. I don't need these rules to govern me anymore.
Right.
Trying to be like, no, I can only do a top and back off set. So what I do in that case is I just stick with my back off set weight. So like I mentioned earlier, back off set might be 10 to 15 reps. So maybe I hit a set of 12. I just stay with the same weight and do it for another set. So maybe I'll get 8 reps on it, and that'll be my third set that I add in.
Do you ever find a benefit of doing that vice versa as well? Like, say you have 2 sets planned and you just get the most out of that first set, and you're like, man, I feel pretty fried after that. You just do 1 set on something.
It's that happens more on prep, I would say, but not. I won't write it off in the off season though. It's definitely happened. That is just so stimulating and taxing that there's no reason to do another one.
Yeah.
You know. Yeah. So usually those are my quad days. Like, and quads are such a strong body part for me. I connect well. I can do 1 set, just completely annihilate them. And so that's my volume levels have been just so low for quads. I do 3 work sets on my leg days for quads, and that's it.
That's all you need. Yeah. I tend to agree with you too on the compound stuff, right? Is like keep them as straight as possible. That way there's always some type of progression you can make. And then I see someone like James Hollinshead, who's made this huge jump in progress this year with his new coach, Patrick Tour, and they're doing like cluster sets in the beginning and stuff like that. Right. And I'm starting to think like, oh man, maybe there's something to that. Maybe I should look into that more, and it's like, that's the stuff that I enjoy doing, right? Because it's like, well, why did it work for James? Because James followed very similar training styles to what we both adhere to. And then it's like, damn, he made crazy progress in 6 months doing this new kind of more volume, effective reps type of training where it's like clusters of 4 with heavy weight and then a top set. And then it's like, man, maybe there's something to look into in that as well, But
yeah, I've listened to Patrick Tour kind of speak on that. He's like, I have guys that are really strong. I try to get them to take the same loads and just do more work with it. Like, well, Patrick, how do you do that? He's like, oh, and it's because his cluster sets, right? So it's like the same load with, you're doing an RIR of who knows what it's at. Maybe it's a 5 or something. You take your set of 10 for a set of 5, and you just do sets of 5 until you reach that failure point.
Very similar to a muscle round that Dr. Scott talks about. Yeah,
exactly. Similar to a muscle round. So could that be something that you rotate in? Like if you have maybe a push day where, you have your top and back off sets, then the other day you have something that's more voluminous and lower RIR. Yeah. Now see, what's funny about that is the way that you state it. You could have guys that are like failure training only, bro. And if you told them in that way, have like Patrick lays it out, they'd be, yeah, cool. You said it with an R5. They'd be like, oh hell no, I'm not training like a pussy. And it's like, well, no, it's the same thing. Or even the muscle round. Like you get guys on board with muscle rounds, but you're like, this isn't like an RIR, approach. You could assign
it's a
RIR
15 rep. It's a 15 rep max, and you're doing sets of 4 with it. It's like, but it's like, but it's Dr. Scott, so the buy-in's like super high. It's like, is always interesting.
You're going to take your 15 rep max and do it for 24 reps. And you're like, oh, hell yeah, that sounds awesome. What do I do? Like, okay.
Or if you do like, you're going to do your 15 rep max for 6 sets of 4, like that's fucking stupid. Then you're like, no, it's 24 reps. Oh man. I get it for sure. But I like seeing that type of stuff because it does make you start to think like, okay, why is somebody at the advanced level able to make such great progress? Because you saw that with a couple of I'm referencing the UK guys because that's who's competed recently, but Jamie Johal is another one, and he followed a more of a Jordan Peters, because Jordan Peters is his coach style, and he's put on a bunch of stage weight as well. So it's like there's so many ways to do it, but I think what you said is like the most important thing. Don't continue to fall into that mindset of like, this is the way I've always done it, so this is the way I have to do it. It's like, this is what works, right? But why does it work? And how can I make it more effective? What are some other ways that I can make it work? And it's like, well, if I am doing a set of 6 and mechanical tension is the biggest thing, if I can take that set of 6, how can I get like 12 reps with that same weight? Oh, if I just do a cluster, then, maybe it's not as taxing because I've never went to true failure on it, but I still got 12 reps when I should only got 6. Like, so it's, one of those things as like a nerd, you always try to think about, you know?
Yeah, it's hard to such a normal approach aside and like go out on a whim
So hard,
and do it, you
man.
know. And I've had even days. I did it one past off season where it's like as a progression, like okay, if I hit a set of 12 with a load, okay, I look at my log, but it's like okay, I'm gonna hit a set of 10, and then rest whatever 30 seconds, and then try to hit whatever the difference might be if I maybe 4 reps then. So
Right. So you get
I'll
14
get,
instead of
yeah,
12. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And it's like, but that is a sense like, well, you're doing your RIR of 2, and then you're doing a set to failure or something. So
Yeah.
however you need to award it, but I don't know. There's lots of ways to do things.
Yeah.
And there's just I think using science to try to filter out to what might truly not be optimal, but also not writing off. You see these guys getting good results. I don't think it's time to rewrite your program,
Right.
but maybe it's something that you could implement and see how it goes. So
Yeah.
I think
because when I think about like the intensifiers that they've done the research on, and it's like it's not very promising at all.
Yeah.
But it's like, well, if you did an intensifier, rep 1 to whatever, you're going to fail completely. But you have these other people coming in and they're doing it. Like, how many of those reps are actually like effective, good reps? And how can you quantify that with the other ones, right? I don't think you'll ever have a study where it's like, oh, we had these professional bodybuilders come in and from rep 1 to rep 12, they fully connected. And like, we know what effective reps truly mean.
Yeah.
Like, you're never going to have that research. So then that's when it's going to be like, well, anecdotally, what am I seeing based on this effective rep model? And it's like, well, that makes a little bit more sense when you compare that. Like, so then you start to disseminate like, okay, well, the research is this and it's not very effective, but clearly like I see it, it's super effective in bodybuilders. Yeah. So why is it effective? And maybe that's the disconnect, right? So that's something to always think about when it comes to that research, because it just blows my mind that like rest pauses and clusters show no inherent value other than it creates more fatigue. And I'm thinking like, like that doesn't make any sense at all, right?
I know.
Dante Trudell is a very smart guy. Dr. Scott they're very smart guys. Why would they have those programmed into their training if they weren't effective? So that's kind of where I always go with the science and the research and stuff like that.
So bringing up fatigue, do you think you need to be entering into a state of high fatigue and seeing performance drop off at the end of your mesocycle? Or if not, then you're not training at an optimal volume level?
You would think that for sure, right? Like this idea of fatigue kind of potentiates your ability to deload so that you can super compensate and recover. You have to reach that threshold of fatigue in order to do that. Because if you don't ever reach that kind of overtraining status, then are you going to have that super compensation phase, or do you really need it, right? Like if you never reach that fatigue state, do you ever need to deload? And is a deload productive? Like those are always the type of things that I tend to think about as well. It's like, do you need to reach maximum capacity of fatigue to elicit, the best stimulus possible? And if the answer is yes, then it's like, well, how do I continue to elicit that amount of fatigue, but also extend my training as well to as much as I can so I don't have to deload? That is a great question. I personally believe, based off the research, that you do have to reach that level of fatigue, right? Cortisol, like acute cortisol spikes, the higher the acute cortisol spike, usually the better the adaptation. And that's going to be a fatigue mechanism. But also fatigue correlates with lactate and hydrogen is something that's very toxic. So it makes it harder to recover from session to session. So, I think that's when it comes to fatigue, I think about it from session to session more so than I think about it from mesocycle to mesocycle. And as long as you're able to continue to go into a training session feeling recovered, then I think that's going to be the most optimal way to do it. But then it's also like, well, would you be more recovered at 2 IRR and continue to make progress or 0? And, that's something that I think is like a personal thing as well. Like if you enjoy training closer to failure, then you're going to train a lot harder. Some people might not be able to gauge where that 2 reps in reserve is. So maybe it's better to push them to failure. Like it's tough, man. It's a tough one to
No,
decipher.
it is. And because you need to keep giving this stimulus, and it's like, okay, I'm not recovering and my loads aren't progressing, I'm gonna decrease my volume. And it's like, well, you could keep decreasing volume enough to where you're always recovering and you're still seeing strength progress, right? And then eventually you're doing a strength training program
Right. But
that's
then
low
how long
volume.
would that last, right? Because your
Yeah,
fatigue may dissipate, but then if your fitness continues to go down with it, then yeah, you got stronger because you peaked. But then
right.
once you peak, you can't hold that peak forever. So then what's the point? So it's a very much a timing thing, right? Like, for powerlifting, you have to time that peak so you can perform the best on that day. But in hypertrophy, like you don't ever need that peak, because
No.
once you peak, then everything else kind of goes to the wayside, and you can't have that because it's not a performance-based sport like that.
Yeah. So what, at least in my own training, for volume, usually the level of fatigue will accumulate in some sense, and the deload will come to me. So I'm not, proactively going to try to reach for the deload
Yeah.
by overreaching and just adding in more just because I'm trying to find the deload. If it doesn't come, well, then I have to ask a question like, hey, am I just recovering great that week? And
Right.
sweet, I'll just keep training, because I've had phases where I don't take a deload for weeks and I'm still progressing loads and reps and I'm training with reasonable volumes, and I am growing because I tape measure and do everything else. So it's like, so the idea is that, maybe are you not training enough if you're not reaching this point of high fatigue to where you need a deload? And I think there's a level you probably adapt to fatigue as well. And to have to handle that work capacity to where there's some buffering there. But
Yeah.
essentially, yeah, eventually I do have to deload. And what's always been my issue is the connective tissue trauma that accumulates.
Yeah.
And usually I'm forced to deload because I had some type
Right.
of issue happen, injury. And so now I just, hey,
Yeah.
6-7 weeks, I'm going to automatically do one, even though I
I
don't need
think,
it,
yeah,
from a preventative.
I think finding that threshold of where that deload should come in is extremely important, because you are right. Like you can adapt to fatigue, but I think your recovery capabilities, I don't think you can sway them too much, right? Especially someone
Yeah.
that's super consistent. So if you find yourself in that 6 to 8 week, there's always a deload or always an injury that occurs that you have to deload, then it should be within that time frame that you do a deload. The hardest thing for an athlete is to think of a deload as a productive week, right? And that's the biggest problem. So there's a bunch of ways to deload, and one of the ways that I found to be really successful is treating it like a transition week, where I go to the gym and I try a bunch of new exercises to find out which one I connect with, so that the variations there's going to be a decrease in volume and intensity because they're new exercises. So I'm not going to be able to push it, but then I may be able to find different exercises that I can add to my next block of training. Whereas opposed to just cutting the volume in half and going to the gym, and not being able to train hard. It's like, well, if I pick a bunch of different exercises, then this transition week will allow me to try new exercises, still train hard, but it's enough of a variation to allow my connective tissues to heal and you can do that for like a week or two, right? Most people think of a deload in a certain context, and it's like, well, if you can expand that context to, what does it really mean to deload? You're trying to reduce volume in some capacity. You can reduce volume by doing the same exercises but increasing the tempo of it. Like if your regular tempo is 2 second concentric, 2 second eccentric, if you do 4 and 4, you're going to decrease the load, but it's still going to be equally as hard training session, right? So there's different ways to go about making that deload more successful, to where it doesn't just feel like a week off. So that way you actually like look forward to it instead of dreading it, and then you get injured, then you're forced to do it.
Have you found, if you switch, would you switch like all the exercises, or are you just talking about maybe just a couple or variations of them?
The ones that create the most fatigue, I would switch.
The ones that create the most fatigue.
Yeah.
Because I was wondering, like, the novelty of that much new training would be like, muscle soreness out the ass, right? Or something.
So like, say if I did barbell rows, right? That's a high demand of fatigue because there's no support. Everything's supported by my structure. So maybe doing a chest supported row or doing a Smith row, something that doesn't have to require so much fatigue demand, that would be the switch that I would go to, right? So those,
Yeah.
they're very similar exercises, but they're not as fatiguing to my joint structure, to my connective tissue and everything else. So that's what I'm really deloading, not so much my muscle tissue as much.
Yeah, I've done deloads so many different ways, and I'm still not yet satisfied
No,
with
it's tough,
any
man.
way that I found. Like I've done it to where I just drop volume in half, and I stay with my top set load, and just pick like if I hit 10 reps, so I'm just going to do 6 reps, like an RIR4.
Yeah.
But then I feel like, gosh, I'm not really relieving my connective tissue much of the load.
Right.
I've also gone into where I've just, hey, I'll pick my top set, my back off set weight. So, so I'm going to work up to this weight that I usually do as a second work set as a first set. So I'm going to be really fresh for it. And I just try to progress that one set.
Yeah.
So maybe it's my 15 rep max that I was working with, and I'm like going to just progress that, but I'm only going to do, one set with it. The load's a lot lighter. I'm not hitting those top set weights. So maybe there is some really connective tissue. At the same time, I still will maybe keep like one in the tank just so I don't, go into that failure set and
but
have that.
It's the same. If it's the same movements, aren't you concerned like the overuse patterns may be the thing that's going to be the most detrimental? Like if you don't ever take a break from those patterns, then do you really allow yourself to heal 100%, right?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And usually I am rotating in a few extra exercises during that time period. But I guess the thing is like how I've wanted to implement like effort and training hard, like the way I like to train, or should you just have times where you just truly are backing off, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you think about it from like a rehab perspective, right? Whenever there are injuries to overuse injuries, like any type of itis or bursitis or tendonitis, right? You want to implement some type of load decrease. And the best way to do that, and also create some type of connective tissue repair, some tensile strength. So tempos would be the best thing to do that, right? Because it's decreasing the load, but it's also increasing the time under tension that your tendons have within those movement patterns. So that's something that I would look to implement maybe for someone in your case that's having these issues, right? You can make training really hard by doing 5-second tempos on everything. So you're going to still get that feeling of like, I pushed my muscles to the absolute limit, but your load's in half. You've actually restructured some of that tendon tissue. It can be pauses. It can be tempo work. On the eccentric, tempo work is really important to do. And that can give you some of that restructure ability during that week or 2 weeks that you need in order for you to continue to progress further on. So from a rehab perspective, that's something that's pretty integral into introducing that to like overuse injuries. So maybe that could be something to look into as well.
I like that. I like the idea of doing tempo training. I think that has kind of been implemented just intuitively as I've like get little niggles and tweaks, just even within the mesocycle. It's like, oh, I'm just going to slow down this movement and pause and make it as hard as possible. It's like, well, you're kind of just deload, but maybe you should do that tempo on your deload anyway. So I like the idea of that. That could be a good approach for sure.
Yeah. Well, awesome, man. I appreciate your time. I feel like I can talk to you about this stuff for a long bit, but it's getting past my bedtime out here, and you're probably ready to eat or something like that. So I appreciate it, man. I know you have your website and stuff, and you also are sponsored by Animal. So if you want to plug any of that, feel free to.
Yeah, anyone that wants to follow me, I'm most active on Instagram at John Jewett 3. My coaching website is J3 Sports RD. Right now, I'm not taking any more clients till after the Olympia. My big project right now is j3university.com. So that'll be a membership subscription site. It'll be a full education platform of basically how to bodybuild. So go through everything from setting your goals, setting your stage picks, building out your program, managing sleep, stress, PEDs. Awesome. The whole shebang. There's nothing off limits within it. So that should be coming around in February is the plan. So we'll have apps for Apple, Android. It'll be well done. I'm really excited about it.
That's awesome, man. Congrats on that for sure.
Thanks.
And then you also have YouTube videos on your own page, and then you also do stuff for Animal as well. That's kind of taking you through the entire prep. So if you want to see John's off season and prep, Animal covers that extensively. You don't do too many videos on your own channel anymore, do you?
No, I haven't done much. So if you want to follow like the Olympia journey, I've been putting all that through the Animal Pack YouTube channel.
I'm sure you're trying to create a bunch of content for the new website. So it's like,
oh man, yeah, that's why I haven't been taking more clients on, because I'm trying to make lectures weekly as much as I can. I eventually plan like, oh yeah, I'll do 100 when we started this, 100 videos, and this was back in March, and there's no way I can do 100 videos this time. I'm lucky to do one a week. Right. So, but for the level I need them to be at, usually they're like an hour long. Eventually, I plan. I'm like, oh yeah, this will be like a 15-minute video. It's like, nope. I just ramble on, but it's good. They're all really good quality videos. So I hope to really help people. That's always been the thing. It's like you coach people, right? And you keep repeating yourself. And it's like, gosh, if I could just help people at a bigger scale. And so that's what this envision for this website's been.
That's awesome, man. I'm looking forward to it for sure. No, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for coming on the show at 5 weeks out now. So good luck with the rest of your prep. Looking forward to seeing you on stage. I don't know if I'll be at the Olympia, but I'll be watching. So good luck with everything, man.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Tony. Appreciate you having me, and always a good chat. Love to come back if you ever want to have me back on.
Yeah, man, definitely. I appreciate it. Have a good night, John.
Okay, you too.